It's time for a spooky story. So what I want to share with you is from my first book, Lilith. And this is an excerpt from chapter 22, which is entitled Southern Hospitality. And I subtitled the chapter Ghosts in the Attic and Rattling Bones. So I'm not starting at the beginning of the chapter, and I want to give you a little background. I was in Savannah, Georgia, and it was a really hot day, and I had been walking for hours and hours, and I wanted to see the squares and different areas in Savannah. And I knew they had pedicabs. Those are bicycle cabs. And I thought, wow, what a great idea. I'd walked all the way up to this market area, and I thought, I'd get myself a nice cold drink and hire a pedicab driver to drive me around so I could see the different squares. These are parks that are in Georgia, in Savannah, and so beautiful. So I came upon a line of pedicab drivers, and I made eye contact with one, and his name was George. And I hired him to take me for a ride, and hired him for a couple hours so we could go traveling around, and he could be my tour guide as well as my driver. So I'm in the back of the cab, and we'd already looked at a bunch of squares and past points of interest that I knew I wanted to go back and check out further. And we were on Whitaker Street at a red light. And so this is where I'm picking up in the chapter. So when at the light at Whitaker Street turned red, George stopped and asked over his shoulder, "Do you want to see the most haunted house in Savannah?" "Do we have to? I'm kind of sensitive," Lilith confessed, shifting in her seat. "Really? In what way?" George inquired, completely fascinated. "I see dead people," she said, quoting a movie. For years, she had been talking to deceased and disembodied spirits. There was a time when she cleared them out of houses for pay, and it had taken a toll on her health. She'd seen her share of crazy and knew better than to walk right into it knowingly. Her highly attuned sense of the unseen realm caused her to develop an ultra-sensitive meter warning just how much insanity would be okay to take. She sensed that this would be way over the limit. See them? Well, I can always smell them and feel them and hear them, and yes, I can usually see them. The look on George's face was enough to tell her that this needed some explaining. So she decided to tell him about some past experiences. "I've always been different. I wasn't like the other children," she began. "When did you realize it?" "I've known from the time I was a little kid. I used to talk to aliens." She could see that George was trying to keep cool and not interrupt. He seemed to be warming up and open to more conversation. "The most intense energy I've ever experienced was in New Orleans. Have you ever been there?" "No, but my dad is from there. I want to go someday." "You should. I've been there several times, and each time my senses and experiences are more intense than the previous visit." She could tell George wanted her to continue, so she decided to lay it all out. "The first time I was there with my parents, we used to meet up in different places, at least once a year for a vacation. They lived in Florida at the time, and my dad loved road trips. So I flew to meet them, and we stayed in a really haunted hotel on Canal Street, right on the edge of the quarter. I had so many visions and experiences in that place, it was almost too much to take." "Like what?" "Blood dripping down the walls, bodies jumping down elevator shafts. But that was nothing compared to..." "Compared to?" "One night, after eating po' boys and listening to jazz on Bourbon Street with my folks, I took off to go on a walking ghost tour. I met with a large group of folks outside Reverend Zombie's voodoo shop on St. Peter's Street. That's where you buy tickets for the tours. You could check it out when you go for a visit. For sure. Anyway, I bought a ticket and stood on the street with a group of people while the guides, who are obviously actors, divided us up. It's way better to have a theatrical guide, don't you think? Definitely, George responded as he continued to pedal. He's a really fun choice for this excursion, she mused. These guides have a true interest in what they do. I think it's a cool way to get an acting gig. On this first tour, I had a particularly great one. He seemed to be one of those guys from SCA, the Society of Creative Anachronism. They dress up and reenact things from European history that took place before the 17th century all over the country. Lots of them do Civil War reenactment and Renaissance festivals. Yeah, we have them all over here. They do ghost tours and Halloween shows, George agreed. How did it go in New Orleans? He asked, wanting the nitty-gritty. Well, we started off in an Irish bar named Pat O'Brien's. Our guide Renee led us past the bar area through a breezeway into a typical French Quarter courtyard garden. He gathered us in a semicircle and began telling us the story of the original owner of the establishment. Renee explained in great detail the story of the gentleman who had owned the building and a terrible argument he had had with his wife. As I looked up to the top of the building, the evening light and all the colors changed. I realized I was watching it all play out. It was as if I could see right through the walls of the second floor above the bar. The sound of Renee's voice faded into the background, and all at once I was watching the original scene. It was wild. I saw the fight. I could hear the yelling. I saw the man hit the woman and knock her out. He dragged her down the stairs from the attic to the second floor, where a row of large windows looks over the courtyard. The man opened one of the windows and tossed the limp body of the woman out. I felt a thunk across the brick paving of the courtyard. Then I flashed my gaze around the group for a moment and saw that everyone was still engaged with the voice of our guide. At that same time, I realized I was watching a live reenactment of the original scene. In my vision, the man ran down the stairs and came storming out the back door of the private side of the building. He reached the body of the woman lifeless on the ground. Then he grabbed a shovel, propped it up against the back wall with one hand and her arm with the other, and started dragging her towards me. Lilith noticed George had stopped the cab and was curled around in the saddle, completely enthralled with the story. She grinned and kept going. They were coming right at me and literally went right through me. It was so cold, like opening the door to a dank, damp cellar. It was all so real, I couldn't believe that the people on either side of me didn't feel the chill. "Wow," said George, his exclamation enough to say, "Keep going, please." Renee asked us if we knew what came next. No one answered. There was just the sound of crickets. George got the joke and giggled. I waited, and still no one tried to answer, so I raised my hand. Renee nodded, and I started right where he had left off, or at least I thought he had. I described the fight, the head clunking, and how the man dragged the limp body of the woman down the stairs to the second floor. I went on about how he shoved her out of the window and how she landed and appeared dead. Then the way he picked up the shovel and took her by the arm and began to drag her across the courtyard. I continued to explain what I had been seeing in the vision up until the pair was right there, right where I was standing. And I saw an apparition of the man digging a hole. The people all looked so confused, unsure if I was really a tourist or part of the theatrics of the tour. "I bet," George exclaimed. Our guide tried to bring it back and question me. "And then what happened?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. A young boy, about 12, came over close to me and stared right up into my face. I looked right back at him and kept going. "Then he dug a hole right here," I said, pointing at the bricks to my right. "And?" asked Renee. Sure, I was done. And she was dead! She began to scream as he was burying her alive, but he just kept going, covering her with dirt, slowly deadening the muffling and her screams. Slowly deadening and muffling her screams with each shovelful. Whoa, George exclaimed. Yeah, right. At that point, it seemed I'd thrown the guide off his game a bit. As we left the site and headed up the street to our next destination, Renee asked me if I had been there before. I assured him I had not, and on top of that, added that I had not read anything about any of it. I pulled out one of my cards, which says, I'm an astrologer and read tarot cards, and handed it to him. He glanced at it before putting it in an inside pocket of his vintage overcoat. He asked me if I'm a psychic. I grinned and asked, how am I doing so far? The young boy overheard our conversation. As soon as Renee moved to the head of the group to lead the pack further, this kid decided to cling to me. At first, I was really annoyed. It had not been my intention to spend the evening with a 12-year-old. But he asked me all sorts of questions and seemed really interested in what I had to say. So I let it go. He walked to the next spot with me. Renee once again gathered us, this time on the sidewalk in front of the 𝙇𝙞𝙡𝙝 house on Royale Street. I didn't even want to be on the same side of the street with the creepy vibes. The kid could see I was feeling something and whispered, what is it? What do you feel? It was then that I started to have a change of heart about this kid. He seemed to get me and understand. As Renee began to talk about Madame Lalaurie, I decided to whisper some of the impressions I was receiving to the boy. Ask Lilith, he chirped when Renee looked around for input. I could hear the air move as everyone whipped their heads to look at me. I added a little about the tutelage of Madame Lalaurie and some wrongdoing involving the torture of slaves. The head spun back to Renee, and he grinned his approval. She's a psychic for sure, yelled the kid. He was instantly a fan and became so excited. As we walked on to the provincial on Chartres Street, he began to ask me off-the-map questions about aliens and other extraterrestrial happenings. I could smell the decay and hear wailing cries as we turned the corner, leaving Ursulinus Avenue behind us. What is it? Asked the kid. Is it really gross? Yes, I responded. It's awful. They're cutting limbs off soldiers unnecessarily. Ah, gross, he said. Lilith knows what's going on, he shouted, and everyone scurried over to me. This was becoming really embarrassing, but Renee had joined in by now, and he was encouraging me. Go on, Lilith, tell us what you're picking up. So I detailed what I was sensing, and once again, it turned out I was right. The stops became a game. Renee would tell a story to the dangling point, and then everyone would look at me, and I would finish it. Unbelievable, George said, though he sounded just a little skeptical. During those tours, there's a stop at a bar for a drink and a break. As we headed to ours, a British gentleman joined the kid and me walking. He said, okay, Miss Psychic, if you're really psychic, you can answer anything, right? I was a little nervous, but said, I'll give it a try. Good answer, George interjected. So when we got to the bar, he sat down across from me in a booth. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card. Then he placed it on the table face down. He kept his finger on it and asked me, okay, Miss Psychic, what do I do for a living? The letters CPA flashed in my mind. I blurted out, certified public accountant, half questioning, as I didn't know if that's what they called it in England. The guy turned pale. His jaw dropped, and he flipped the card over and handed it to me. Sure enough, there was CPA next to his name. Amazing, George said, hopping back into the saddle and beginning to pedal the bike once again. Ha! Well then, we'll have to test your skills. Oh boy, said Lilith, wondering if she had overstepped a boundary. Where are we going? The most haunted house in Savannah, 423 Abercorn Street, George replied. I can feel it already, she moaned. It's stabbing me here in my liver. She continued holding her right side. Let's not go, she groaned, doubling over in the seat of the cab. Really? Said George, turning around for a second look at her. He pedaled around the corner onto Abercorn and parked the cab along the side of the square opposite the house. Oh God, something awful happened there. I can feel it. Tell me everything you see. It's more what I'm feeling right now, Lilith began as she gave in to the sensation. She said a silent prayer of forgiveness and protection, and then dove into the images of the vision. Oh my God, something heinous happened here. A man killed his child, a girl child. I can't go near it. Get me out of here, she screamed, doubled over. What else? Asked George. You sure? Nothing else? Somehow Lilith gathered her strength and went back into the sensation. A single father, angry for so many reasons. He loved a slave, and it tortured him to the point of torturing his own child. The child loved the slave's children. She just wanted to play with them, but the father was so frustrated that it drove him mad. He tied his own child up. She sat up there, Lilith said, pointing to the window, to the side of the grand entryway, which looked over Calhoun Square. She wanted to play with her friends. They were here, in the square. A tear fell onto her cheek. George thought to stop, but the roll of energy was overwhelming. There was no turning back. She jumped out of the cab and stood in the street, fully taken by the vision. Her arms moved in the air as she described the events. He felt so bad, so guilty, but he couldn't stop himself. He was doomed to fade away slowly in agonizing pain of self-loathing. For a moment, Lilith surfaced out of the vision, but was pulled to continue. Next, there was a family with several children, girls. It was the play that killed them. Once they would play, the anger of the dead child's spirit possessed the youngest, and I can't stand it, it's awful. She took her water and splashed some on her head. How am I doing? George was keeping a straight face, but inside he was truly blown away by her precision. This is the real deal, he thought, as he watched her. There's more. Something happened in the yard. Now her curiosity took over. Come on, we have to go over here. There's something in the garden. She felt it and took off running across the street. George followed, leaving the cab and all her things behind. He watched as she was pulled magnetically to touch the metal of the garden fence. The trees spoke to her. She continued. A deal gone bad. The slaughter of innocent slaves in the shade of that balcony. She pointed to the second-level veranda running the length of the house. Government officials making bad deals, a card game. The images were coming so fast, she whipped through a rapid succession of scenes, like the cards being thrown down in the play she was witnessing through the thick back wall of the tan house. Suddenly, she saw where she was. Get me out of here now, she screamed into George's face. He turned and ran back to the cab, with her just behind him. Lilith stood for a moment, grounding herself, and then reached into the cab, grabbed her water bottle, and poured some of the clear elixir of life into the cupped palm of her right hand. She leaned her head over the liquid and chanted an audible Om. As she witnessed the geometry of the prayer in her mind's eye, she then took the vibrating water and splashed some on George's crown and then on her own head. She dabbed some on her third eye and then his. So, how did I do? She asked, taking a deep breath and flopping onto the seat of the rickshaw. "Unbelievable!" exclaimed George. "Not only did you nail the stories, you did it chronologically." "Really?" Lilith questioned, furrowing her brow. "Want to go to St. John's Cathedral?" asked George. "Perfect choice. Let's go." The further they got from Abercorn House, the better Lilith felt. As the cab slowed down in front of the huge cathedral, she leapt out and bounded up the steps. The sign said that there was a mass going on, so she took care to open the door into the main sanctuary quietly. Once inside, she went straight to the font of holy water and scooped some into her hands. She blessed herself like a proper Catholic, nodded to a guardian who was seated in the back pew, and stood quietly for a moment to take in the splendor of the carved statues and gilded paintings. That was all it took. She scooped up another handful of water and bounded out the door and back down the steps to George, who was waiting in the street with her chariot. After she splashed some of the holy water on George, the two were off to the next square. Thanks for listening. That was an excerpt from my first book, Lilith, a novel, and there's more stories in there for you. Thank you to all my friends who've tuned in. I hope I've inspired you to dig up some of your stories for this Halloween season and my favorite month of October. I'm partial because it's my birthday month. I'll see you soon.